about 24 hours before the storm made landfall, Tim and I decided, okay, it's a Category 5. We are not staying.
But it was too late. Tim and Tobi Flair didn't have time to escape Hurricane Katrina as it was making landfall on the Gulf Coast.
Had it not been for the 6 pine trees that leaned on the house would have gone away. But the pine trees shifted the roof about 6 inches and then held the house in place.
Tim and Toby were in the middle of the chaos with their 3-year-old son, Ashton. And this is where our story begins. You're listening to GPS, God, People, Stories, an outreach of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. I'm Jim Kirkland.
And I'm Phil Fleischman. Tim and Toby's faith had grown routine. Then God would use a hurricane to prepare them for their greatest trial in life. Here's what Billy Graham said about the importance of faith.
You who are listening to my voice today in the midst of the storms of life, are you able to stand in the face of the storms of your own life and say, I have faith in God?
Billy Graham has more to say about having that kind of faith a little later in the episode. But if you'd like to hear more about how to place your faith in Jesus Christ right now, head over to our website, findpeacewithgod.net. That's findpeacewithgod.net.
GPS.
God.
People. Stories.
So we got married at the university. There was a chapel there. I say a chapel, it was really large, actually. And so we were given permission to get married there. And it was important to us to be married in the place where our relationship really grew.
That was in New Orleans, and it wasn't far from where Tim and Toby grew up.
I was coming out of a very difficult relationship, had a lot of turmoil in it. And Tim was the one who really helped me out of that relationship. He helped me to heal, and that's really how it started. So we dated for, I say 7 years. We dated for quite some time before we got married.
We got married in 1999, and it was a beautiful life, still is a beautiful life, don't get me wrong. And Toby had endometriosis at the time, so we were very concerned about being able to have kids. But God graced us with Ashton in 2002. In 2005, Katrina hit.
Tim and Toby knew the storm was headed to the Gulf Coast, but they weren't planning on needing to leave.
Ashton was 3 years old. And when Katrina was coming, okay, when we knew that it was headed for our area, because originally Katrina was not supposed to hit New Orleans. It was gonna take the panhandle of Florida. And so there was kind of this scuttlebutt of last minute preparation to try to get out of the area. And we did not leave until Sunday morning, okay? And Katrina hit on Monday morning. So really, about 24 hours before the storm made landfall, Tim and I decided, okay, it's a Category 5. We are not staying.
Gathering your things and preparing for a hurricane is no easy task, especially with a 3-year-old in tow.
So we packed up as much of his toys and our clothing. And at this point, 24 hours before landfall, it's not like we could not travel very far. We didn't want to travel far, but we couldn't because at that point, hotels and whatnot, they were all booked up. So we rode out Katrina with Ashton in a pack and play, in a playpen. Tim and I slept on the floor. Ashton was in the playpen, and we rode out Katrina in Bush, Louisiana.
The Flairs were staying at their cousin's farm in Bush, Louisiana. It was about an hour and a half away from their own home in the New Orleans suburb of Metairie. Not only did their cousin's home survive the hurricane, but their livestock had their own special way of weathering the storm.
It was funny because we were watching their farm animals, and when the gusts of 100 whatever mile an hour winds would come, the cattle would kind of lean into the wind and then they would stand straight up. And when I say lean in, they were looking at like a 45 degree. It was amazing how they knew what to do in an open area. And then meanwhile, all of their barns and that metal shed, those were blowing away, but the cattle were out in the open field and they were fine.
That's an amazing image. Think about that. The cows responded in a way we might think counterintuitive. They leaned into the storm.
After the storm had passed, there were so many downed pine trees that Tim and his cousins literally took chainsaws and cut pathways through roads to try to get vehicles and be able to get out of that area. So yeah, it was probably a period of like 6 to 8 weeks that we weren't even in Metairie. We were house jumping to try to get back, to Metairie and dealing with the devastation.
Tim and Toby stayed with friends on their long journey back home. As they made their way back, Tim remained focused on surveying the damage and making repairs.
The Metairie house got 10 inches of water, 13 inches of water. So we ended up raising our house 16 inches on one side and 20 inches on the other side because the house had a little deviation. We have 3 rental properties in Metairie. One of those rental properties got 10 inches of water. The other one's got minor roof damage. My mother's house in the city of New Orleans got 5 feet of water. Our Waveland house, had it not been for the 6 pine trees that leaned on the house would have gone away. But the pine trees shifted the roof about 6 inches and then held the house in place.
It must have been a monumental task to have to consider not only repairing your own home, but a number of others as well. But Tim was up for the job.
I'm one of those get it done, fix it, organize it, figure out how to move on. But I'm also known as Tightwad Tim, so I like doing a lot of stuff myself to save money on the other side. So to be honest, faith wasn't in my thought process. God did this. Why did God do this? He challenges us all the time.
A year later, still deep in the process of repairing and rebuilding, the Flairs were on a much-needed vacation when they received terrible news. Toby suffered a miscarriage.
We were a year after Katrina. We were living in a FEMA trailer. I mean, Ashton was 4 years old at the time. We were trying to rebuild Tim's mom's house in New Orleans, our house in Metairie, still dealing with the properties in Mississippi in such turmoil when you're living in all of that mess. Finding out that you're expecting a child is just, it's such a gift, and it's a shift in thinking from all of the muck that you've been living in and dealing with. It's like the ray of sunshine in the dark moments. And then when it's taken away, it's like, boy, it just thrusts you right back into the pit that you were living in.
It was beginning to seem like it was one bad thing after another. But God opened Toby's heart to a new perspective in light of everything that was happening in her life.
And I remember thinking this very vividly. I threw my hands up and I said, this is not for me to decide or govern. This has nothing to do with me. I give up. I'm going to give it over to you, and I'm going to let you be the captain of this ship. You decide what happens. If we have another child, if we are graced with another child, what a gift. Thank you. And if we don't, then we're going to love Ashton to pieces. But I had to hand it over, and I said, okay, Lord, this is on you. You make the decision. You touch our lives in the way that you need to. And I handed it over.
God was beginning a work in Toby that would carry them through an even bigger storm that was still ahead.
Indeed, God can use terrible moments in our lives to show us the importance of relying on Him, as Toby can attest.
When something like Katrina happens, something on such a large scale that devastates so many areas, you rely on God as much as you can to get you through it, and to help you understand that all things are passing. Everything is rebuildable, but all things are passing, right? So just let it go.
It can be hard to let go of worldly things, even though, as Tim and Tobi Flair reminded us, those things don't last. But when you trust your life to Jesus Christ, you begin a relationship that never ends. You can find out more about beginning that kind of a relationship with Jesus right now. Just visit our website, findpeacewithgod.net. That's findpeacewithgod.net.
Coming up, you'll hear a preview of next week's episode as Tim tells us about the moment that changed his life more than any hurricane could.
You're listening to GPS, God, People, Stories, a podcast production of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association.
There are storms in the world today. Storms of unbelief, materialism, secularism, moral degeneracy, racial hatred, and strife. There are storms in your own life. Storms of temptation, confusion, and difficulty.
Billy Graham.
You who are listening to my voice today in the midst of the storms of life, are you able to stand in the face of the storms of your own life and say, I have faith in God? The Bible says that we're saved by faith. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. In other words, no man has his sins forgiven. No man can go to heaven until he has personal faith in Jesus Christ. Do you have that kind of faith? Today, will you give your life to Christ? Will you put your faith in Him?
If you'd like to know more about faith that can weather any storm, you can talk to someone right now. Call our prayer line at 888-388-2683. That's 888-388-2683.
You're listening to the Flair family, Tim and Toby, on this episode of GPS. They went through so much with Hurricane Katrina. However, on our next episode, you're going to hear how their greatest trial was still ahead.
Just like in the movies, exactly like in the movies. I was sitting inside watching the news right before I left for work, and two military guys show up at your front door. And the first thing they always say, like I said, just like in the movies, are you Mr. Flair? And I said, yes. They said, the Secretary of Defense sends his condolences. Your son passed away last night.
That's part of what we will hear next week in part 2 of the Flair family story. Next week's episode is going to be the final episode for our God's Presence in Disaster series. We want to thank Tim and Tobi Flair for sharing their experience with Hurricane Katrina and the following years of rebuilding, and also the poignant story they're going to be sharing next week. I'm Jim Kirkland.
And I'm Phil Fleischman. You can subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app to get the latest episodes when they release. And you can also sign up for the weekly e-newsletter from Billy Graham Radio. It's called Weekend Encouragement, and it contains all kinds of uplifting content from us, including all the episodes of GPS. And we will include a link to it in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of GPS, God, People, Stories. It's an outreach of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. Always good news.